I texted the family group chat, "Flight lands at 5 p.m. Can someone pick me up?" I had just buried my wife overseas. My brother replied, "We are busy. Try Uber?" My mom added, "Why didn't you plan better?" I simply wrote, "No worries." What they saw on the news that night made them drop their phones. I'm Lewis, and that rejection, delivered after 30 hours of travel and the deepest grief I'd ever known, was the moment I realized I was finally on my own. The cabin lights of the long haul flight were too bright, even when dimmed. Bota. They cast a sickly yellow glow over the tired faces around me as the plane began its final, shuddering descent into Denver International. I sat by the window, unable to adjust my eyes, which felt raw and swollen from days without true sleep and nights saturated with weeping. At 32, I was exhausted beyond reason, my body stiff and aching. I wore the same black shirt I'd worn to the funeral 2 days earlier, Bada, and the recycled air of the cabin felt dry and abrasive against my skin. For the last 24 hours, one sentence had looped in my mind like a cruel screensaver. I just buried Seraphina on the other side of the world. My thumb rubbed the polished surface of my wedding band. The metal had long since warmed under my touch, a small, continuous anchor. For a split second, the image of Seraphina's gravesite outside flashed so vividly that the plane, the humming engines, and the strangers around me vanished. I saw only the small, quiet plot tucked beneath a line of late autumn pines. Then the captain's voice broke the trance, announcing our final approach and wishing us well. I swallowed a hard, dry lump in my throat and reached for my phone. Notifications exploded across the screen, emails from work, security alerts from my bank, and a series of weather warnings. The last one was a winter advisory, cautioning Colorado residents that temperatures were dropping into dangerously low territory. I barely processed the temperature warning. Instead, I opened the family group chat. The Holt crew. There were 4 members, my brother Nolan, my mother Marianne, my father Grant, and me, Lewis. I was always the one to reach out first, the one who stepped into the silence when the others didn't. My fingers hovered for a moment above the keyboard. Despite everything, the anticipation was still there, the flicker of a hope I'd spent my entire life trying to extinguish. I typed the simple message, broken into 2 parts, to seem less urgent. Flight lands at 5 p.m. Can someone pick me up? It was a simple, reasonable request. The kind of thing any family would rally around, Boda, especially after I'd been across the world managing a sudden death and funeral alone. But I knew my family wasn't any family. I stared at the screen while we taxied, pretending not to watch the bubbles appear. Boda. I had spent most of my life trying not to be an inconvenience, not to need too much. Boda. Not to disrupt the rhythm of a household that had always spun around Nolan's busy life and my mother's stringent schedule. A bubble appeared. Nolan's reply was instant, cutting through the silence of my grief with the sharp precision of a business email. We are busy. Try Uber, 8 words. Not even a comma, much less a question about how I was holding up or if I was okay to ride alone after such a debilitating trip. Just logistics, as if I'd asked him to grab milk from the store. A second bubble popped up before I could fully absorb the first. My mother, Marianne. Why didn't you plan better? You know how full our schedules are. Her schedules, her social calendar, her bridge club, commitments she guarded like national security clearance. My father, Grant, didn't bother typing. He reacted to Nolan's message with a thumbs up emoji, a gesture I'd seen so many times growing up it had become a signature punctuation mark in our household. Good enough. Moving on. I stared at the three responses. My throat tightened painfully. I wanted to tell them the truth, that my hands were still shaking from lowering a casket into foreign soil, that I hadn't slept in 3 days, Boda, that I had walked out of a cemetery carrying only a folded letter and the necklace Seraphina wore every morning. I wanted to say that I didn't have the strength to drag 3 heavy suitcases across a frozen parking lot. I wanted to type, I just buried your daughter in law. But the old instinct kicked in, the one that told me never to make things dramatic, never to be a burden, never to expect more than they were willing to spare. So, like a reflex, I wrote, no worries. I'll figure it out. And just like that, I stepped back into the role I had been assigned my whole life, the son, who never needed too much. The plane doors opened, and a blast of cold, clean Denver air seeped into the cabin. Passengers stood up, eager to get home to family, to warmth, to routine. Meanwhile, Bada, Ike, all I had was a text thread full of people who treated my grief like a scheduling conflict. The words, no worries, glowed like a lie I had swallowed whole. I had no idea that before midnight, Bada, those same words would echo back at my family through a television screen. The real storm had only just begun. The cold of the Denver night outside the terminal mirrored the cold sinking into Louis's chest, a chill that had nothing to do with the winter advisory screens flashing warnings overhead. By the time I reached the luggage carousel, the airport was already buzzing with announcements about the incoming cold snap. The wind cut across the pavement outside, sharp and metallic. Bota. I hauled my three heavy suitcases onto a cart. They were filled with every remnant of Seraphina's life I couldn't bear to leave behind, and arranged for a ride share. The price was nearly double the usual rate, but I tapped accept without hesitation. Money was irrelevant compared to the deep, weary exhaustion. I sat in the back of the car, my forehead pressed against the cold glass, watching Denver's city lights smear into streaks of color as the driver, a quiet man, navigated the highway toward Boulder. I didn't speak, unwilling to let the words, I buried my wife alone on the other side of the world, escape my mouth. Saying it out loud would have broken me entirely. The car's heater blasted warm air, but none of it reached the hollow space in my chest. Instead, my mind drifted backward, because to understand how I ended up returning to Colorado alone, wearing her wedding ring on a chain around my neck, I had to go all the way back to Austin, Texas, where Seraphina and I began. It was a working space full of too many Edison bulbs and a sputtering coffee machine. I was presenting at a design workshop when Seraphina Vale, a software engineer who moved with an intensity that pulled the air around her, dropped an entire cup of hot coffee right onto my laptop. She froze, I froze. My laptop hissed in protest, and then she burst into the most unfiltered laugh I had ever heard. Okay, she said, brushing her hair back and looking directly at me. If I buy you a new laptop, will you forgive me? Or do you prefer daily coffee sacrifices? I remembered thinking, who laughs like that at a disaster? Who looks that alive at 9 in the morning? Sabota. She insisted on buying me a replacement drink, and we sat at a corner table talking for hours about everything from coding patterns to the absurdity of the workshop snacks. During that conversation, my phone buzzed incessantly. The Holt crew group chat was going wild over Nolan's newest sales award, including memes, photos, and Marion's proud press release-worthy paragraphs. Not one person noticed I was presenting that morning, even though I'd told them 2 weeks earlier. Seraphina saw the notifications lighting up my screen. She raised an eyebrow. "Your family's enthusiastic," she said, before adding softly, "but none of them asked how your talk went." I remember shrugging. I'd spent my whole life shrugging off things that hurt. From that day on, everything with her moved effortlessly. We debated UI design, ordered takeout on the couch, and filled our small Austin apartment with laughter. When remote work became permanent, we chose Boulder. Mountain air, the fresh seasons, a place where we could build a quiet life away from the city. My family was less thrilled. Colorado was too far, too inconvenient for holidays, too remote for Marion's taste. Nolan's only concern was about the salary being sufficient to justify the hassle. But we moved anyway. We bought a small house with a yard big enough for her to plant sunflowers. Seraphina baked on Sundays, boda, dancing barefoot in the kitchen while I sat at my desk, facing the Rockies, constantly wondering how I got so lucky. The driver pulled into my driveway just as dusk fell. The air outside was sharp enough to sting my lungs, just as the weather advisory had warned. I paid, thanked him, and dragged the 3 suitcases up the steps. I unlocked the door and stepped into complete darkness. The house felt frozen, still, and untouched. I flipped the light switch. Nothing happened. My stomach tightened. The temperature inside was bitter. I walked over and checked the thermostat screen. It was off, completely off. Before leaving for Sewell, I had asked Marianne to turn the heat on the day before I returned, reminding her of the coming cold snap. She had agreed without hesitation. Yet the screen was blank, lifeless. I walked into the kitchen, Sabota, hoping to find something that made the place feel less abandoned. The refrigerator held only long, expired condiments and a few containers of food mottled with mold. Nolan had promised he'd restock the fridge with basics for me. Another promise evaporated into the icy air. A wave of exhaustion hit me so hard, I dropped onto the sofa, instead of going upstairs to our bedroom. Boda. I couldn't bring myself to open the suitcases just yet. I knew her clothes were inside, folded by someone else's hands. I texted the family a quick, "Just got home." No one replied. I forced myself to assume they were busy. The cold crept deeper as I fell asleep in my coat, curled awkwardly on the couch. The memory of Seraphina's warmth already fading. Sabota. The freezing house and the broken promises were merely the closing chapter of a story that began thousands of miles away. In a Sewell hospital room, I never should have had to navigate alone. To understand the depth of the rejection I felt now, curled in my coat on the couch, you had to understand the weeks that preceded it. Just days before everything shattered, Seraphina and I had ended our morning video call the way we always did. She was sitting cross-legged on her apartment floor in Sewell, Boda, her hair in a messy bun, her eyes tired but still teasing. She mentioned a headache that had been bothering her for hours, brushing it off with a laugh, blaming the all-nighter she'd pulled for a project deadline. I told her to rest. She told me she would, but we both knew she probably wouldn't. 8 hours later, while I was eating reheated leftovers in Boulder, my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. When I answered, a rush of panicked Korean and broken English tumbled into my ear. Worker of hers was shouting over the chaos around him. Something about Seraphina collapsing mid-meeting, being rushed to the emergency room, a possible aneurysm. Doctors were working on her. I stood there, frozen, the fork still in my hand, Boda, unable to form words. He apologized profusely for his English, but it wasn't the language barrier that made everything incomprehensible. It was the sheer, suffocating terror of imagining her alone in that hospital. I booked the next flight I could find Boulder to Denver, Denver to Lax to Seoul. Every layover was a blur of fluorescent lighting and airport chairs. At the boarding gate, I sent a message to the family group chat explaining that Seraphina was in critical condition. The replies came quickly, but they were hollow. Nolan wrote, "Keep us posted." Marianne texted, "Let us know what the doctors say." There was not a single question about me. Not one offer to help with the house or the logistics of my sudden, terrifying departure. The subtext was clear, loud enough to ring in my ears over the gate announcements, "Update us." But do not ask for anything more. Sabota. When I finally reached the hospital in Seoul, a nurse with a tired face led me through a maze of quiet hallways into the intensive care unit. The smell of disinfectant hung thick in the air. Machines beeped steadily, their cold, measured patterns too calm for the frantic terror I felt inside. Seraphina lay in a bed surrounded by tubes and wires, her skin pale, her chest rising and falling only because the ventilator forced it to. A doctor with kind eyes and excellent English explained quietly that an aneurysm had ruptured. The damage was massive. The chances were slim. Boda. I sat beside her, telling her everything I could think of about the snow in Boulder, about the bakery she loved on Pearl Street, about the silly joke she'd made just days ago. I talked because the silence terrified me. I talked because I couldn't bear the thought that she might slip away without hearing my voice one last time. Later, when a nurse checked her chart, I glanced over her shoulder and froze. Under the section for emergency contacts, the first name listed was mine. The second was her former professor in Austin. There was no mention of my parents, my brother, or anyone from the Holt family. That line on the page hit me harder than anything the doctors had said. Boda. It confirmed something she'd been trying to show me for years in her life. I was the family. My family, in her eyes, were strangers. But when I called Marianne to tell her the severity of the situation, her first question was whether insurance would cover the hospital stay and if we were being overcharged. Nolan said that if things looked too grim, maybe I should consider bringing her back to the States quickly so costs wouldn't escalate. No one asked if I had eaten. No one asked if I was alone. When I asked if they could possibly fly to Seoul, if things took a turn for the worse, Marianne hesitated, then said the flights were too expensive and she had social commitments she couldn't miss. 3 days later, The doctors called me into a consultation room. They explained that her brain had no meaningful activity, that she was not in pain, but that she wouldn't recover. Keeping her on the machines would only prolong what little was left. My signature felt like the heaviest thing I had ever written. The funeral happened in a modest chapel outside Seoul. A handful of her colleagues came. A few American expats I'd never met showed up with flowers, offering their condolences quietly. Sabota. I propped my phone on a small stand and started a video call to include the Holt crew. Boda. Marianne complained about the lighting hurting her eyes and left the call early. Nolan stayed on for a few minutes before announcing he had to jump onto a client meeting. My father didn't say anything at all. After the service, I checked our group chat. One message awaited me from Marianne. You did what you could. Now focus on getting home and sorting things out. No one wrote, we are sorry. No one asked how I was standing upright. I inquired about bringing her body home, but the cost was staggering, far beyond anything I could manage, even with insurance covering a portion. Exhausted and nearly out of money, I made the choice to bury her in Seoul, not in the place she once called home. Marianne's only response was another blow. Do whatever you think is reasonable. Just don't take out loans from us. I picked a burial plot on a quiet hillside overlooking maple trees. I tucked a worn paperback, a small photo, and a Rockies keychain beside the headstone during my last visit before flying out. As I walked back toward the exit, two of her co-workers whispered to each other, one saying softly, "Usually family comes." The words stung more than the cold wind, Boda. By the time I boarded my flight back to the US, I was nearly maxed out on my credit card, drained in every possible way. I thought the worst was behind me. I thought I was going home to rest, to recover, to let myself fall apart within familiar walls. But whatever I imagined as safer home no longer existed. The freezing house in Boulder was waiting. Back in Boulder, the emotional freezing point I'd reached in Seoul found its physical mirror when I woke to the sound of water rushing where there should only be silence. It wasn't restful sleep, just a deep, cold unconsciousness that had pulled me under for a few hours. I woke violently, disoriented. The bone, deep chill instantly overridden by panic. For a second, half, dreaming, I thought it was raining, the sound loud, insistent. The house then, I sat up. Water was pouring from the ceiling, streaming through the light fixtures, down the walls, and across the kitchen cabinets. I swung my legs off the sofa and waded through a shallow pool forming rapidly on the floor. It was freezing. The pipes in the ceiling had burst overnight, frozen solid with no heat running to protect them. The warnings I'd ignored on the airport radio came back like a cruel, mocking taunt. I scrambled for my phone, my hands shaking not just from the cold, but from sheer terror. The temperature inside the house must have been close to 40 degrees, and the water was rising. I needed an emergency plumber immediately. I began calling, starting with the biggest names. Every line I called gave me the same answer: too many burst pipes across the county. The earliest appointment I could get was in 3 to 4 days. The house kept flooding while my breath fogged in front of me. In desperation, I called Nolan. The house is unlivable, Nolan. I managed, my voice hoarse. The temperature is freezing, and the ceiling pipes burst. I have inches of water. Can I stay with you and Sarah for a few nights? I just need a couch. There was a pause, a sigh that carried a palpable weight of annoyance. Lewis, their guest room is full of storage boxes. He said, his tone measured and impatient, as if I were interrupting a crucial presentation. And we are hosting a dinner with clients this evening. Duh. A big one. I can't disrupt the arrangement. You need to get a motel or just file an insurance claim. Quick. I'll text you the number. He hadn't asked if I was safe. He hadn't asked if I was hurt. He just offered logistics and inconvenience. The line went dead. I stared at the phone in my hand, the ice creeping into my fingers. Next, I called Marianne. She answered with a cheerful, clipped tone that suggested I was interrupting something far more important than a life or death situation. Lewis, I can't talk long. I am preparing for the bridge club to meet here tomorrow, and I really don't want to disrupt the arrangement, she said, her voice laced with warning. This is just water, dear. Why are you overreacting? Grant's back is bothering him, and he absolutely cannot handle extra stress. You need to find a solution on your own. Mom, it's not just water. The house is below freezing. The pipes exploded. I have nowhere to go. Well, you need to find somewhere warm immediately, she said firmly, completely missing the point. Go to a hotel. Do not call us with this panic. You know how full our schedules are. Then, my father, Grant, came on the line for a moment. He didn't apologize for his earlier indifference or offer to help. He simply instructed, in his familiar, low voice, stay warm, son, before handing the phone back to Marianne. Standing in the freezing water pooling at my feet, the shock finally gave way to a sickening clarity. I realized that if I were truly drowning right then, Boda, they would still ask me to schedule it around their plans. My literal survival was an inconvenience. My life was less important than Nolan's sales, clients, or Marianne's bridge club. The lights began flickering violently. Water had seeped into the light fixtures in the kitchen. Boda and the plumber I had desperately contacted on another line had warned me to shut off the circuits to avoid a fire. Groggy, light-headed, and shivering uncontrollably, I forced myself toward the basement stairs to find the electrical panel. The stairs were slick with water. The basement floor glistened with a thin sheet of water already accumulating there. I shuffled toward the gray metal panel, telling myself it would only take a second to find the main switch. The bitter cold of the house seemed to press against my skin, driving the air from my lungs. Standing in the rising, freezing water, with the phone call still ringing in my ears, I knew the emergency was mine and mine alone to solve. I had to get to the electrical panel. I descended into the basement, one shaky step at a time. The air down there was stiller, colder, and dense with the smell of wet earth and copper. Boda. The basement floor was glistening with a thin, icy sheet of water that had seeped in through the foundation and the growing leak. I shuffled toward the electrical panel on the far wall, trying to stay close to the concrete steps for support. My head was pounding. The lack of sleep, the crushing grief, the freezing temperatures, Saboda, and the possible carbon monoxide from the unmaintained furnace I had been breathing since I woke up were all working against me. I wasn't thinking clearly. I was operating on pure, desperate survival instinct, the need to avoid a fire. My hand reached out for the heavy gray metal box that held the fuses. At that exact moment, my right foot slid out from under me on the icy film coating the floor. I felt my arm strike the panel hard. A sharp, violent current shot up my right arm, snapping through my chest like a whip. The pain was immediate, blinding, and overwhelming. The world blinked out for an instant, a flash of white light overriding the black panic. When everything came back, I was on the floor, flat on my back, my head throbbing where it had struck the hard cement. The side of my face was wet, either with blood or the frigid water. I couldn't tell. My muscles twitched uncontrollably. The shock had temporarily paralyzed me. I could barely breathe. I wasn't thinking about Seraphina or the funeral or the money. I was simply thinking up. I have to get up. The air in the house had grown colder still. My fingers were numb, stiff. I crawled back up the slick basement stairs, dragging my body one aching step at a time. I forced myself back onto the sofa in the living room. It was slightly drier, but offered no warmth. The wet clothing on my back felt like a sheet of ice. I tried reaching for my phone again, wanting to call a different friend, anyone who might help, but my muscles refused to cooperate. My vision tunneled. A low, persistent humming sound began in my ears, making it impossible to focus on the cold reality of the flooded house. Then, through the fog creeping through my mind, a sharp, mechanical screaming started up. It came from the hallway near the ceiling. The carbon monoxide detector. It was screaming, a high, pitched, insistent wail, but the sound seemed distant, muffled, sabota, swallowed by the confusion settling over my thoughts. The lack of heat meant the furnace was likely damaged and venting improperly. I tried again to reach my phone, but my arm felt like lead, weighted down by the electrical trauma and the deepening hypothermia. My tongue felt thick in my mouth. My head lolled against the cushion. A single, fractured thought drifted through me, quiet and darky. Maybe this wouldn't be the worst way to go. Maybe I would see her again. I closed my eyes, letting the darkness pull me under. I surrendered to the cold, to the silence, to the final, fatal inconvenience. What happened next, I only learned hours later, after I woke up in the blindingly white hospital room. Ethan Foster, my neighbor across the street, a retired firefighter, had noticed something wasn't right. He saw water pouring from beneath my front door, freezing instantly on the porch. Then he heard the faint, high-pitched bleating of the CO alarm blaring inside the house. He pounded on the door. When I didn't answer his knocking, he didn't wait for permission or call Marion or Nolan for advice. He simply called 911. Firefighters broke down the door and found me unconscious on the sofa. I was severely hypothermic with dangerously high carbon monoxide exposure. One of the paramedics picked up my phone, which had slipped to the floor. Boda. The screen lit up with the last messages in the Holt crew chat. The 4 lines, glowing from a cracked screen in a freezing house. Flight lands at 5 p.m. Can someone pick me up? We are busy. Try Uber. Why didn't you plan better? No worries. Those 4 lines became the unintentional Boda, damning prelude to everything that followed on the local news later that night. Waking up in the sterile, bright hospital room felt like being pulled from a deep sea grave. But the real shock was still waiting for me, delivered not by a doctor, but a night nurse and a television screen. I was in a blindingly white room. The steady, hypnotic beep of a monitor synchronized with the pounding inside my skull. My right arm was heavily wrapped where I'd made contact with the electrical panel. My clothes were gone, and despite the thick blankets, I felt cold deep in my bones, a lingering chill the hospital heat couldn't touch. Nurse Sarah explained what happened in the calmest voice imaginable. Hypothermia, severe carbon monoxide poisoning, a concussion from hitting my head, and electrical trauma. Another hour or two in those conditions. She said quietly, looking at me with genuine compassion, and you might not have woken up, Lewis. The thought hit harder than the shock itself. Bada. While I lay unconscious and freezing, my family had been living a completely normal evening. Nolan at his client dinner, Marianne probably finalizing her bridge club plans. None of them knew. None of them had checked. Sarah began the intake questions. Who do you live with? Anyone nearby to help with your discharge? When I told her my wife, Seraphina Boda, had died less than 2 weeks ago in Seoul, she put her pen down and really looked at me, not as a patient, but as a person. You went through all of that alone? She asked. I nodded. She wrote something in my chart, limited family support. For once, Boda. The description felt accurate, honest, and completely devastating. What I didn't know was that my case had already caught someone's attention. Ethan Foster, the retired firefighter who called 911, had mentioned my situation to a local reporter, Michael Chen, who was covering storm injuries. Ethan didn't know my name, only that the man who just buried his wife overseas almost froze to death alone, which was the perfect, horrible headline. When the firefighter added the detail about my phone still being open to the text messages, Michael Chen, the reporter, stopped and asked more questions. By early evening, a full news segment had formed. A Colorado man returns from his wife's overseas funeral, is denied a ride by family, and nearly dies after pipes burst during a historic freeze. They interviewed Ethan, the neighbor who saved my life. A graphic recreated my text messages. No names were given, but the dialogue was the key. That night, Jessica, the night nurse, hesitated before turning on the small television mounted high on the wall. You might want to see this, Lewis, she said, Boda, her voice laced with concern. I watched in silence as my life, my private grief, my near-death experience, Boda, and my family's callous indifference played out in front of thousands of people. The camera showed blurred footage of my house, the front door, broken open, and then a graphic appeared showing the 4 lines of dialogue that had defined my life for 30 years. I texted the family group chat flight lands at 5 p.m. Can someone pick me up? I had just buried my wife overseas. My brother replied, we are busy. Try Uber. My mom added, why didn't you plan better? I simply wrote, no worries. What they saw on the news that night made them drop their phones. Hearing a reporter read the line, why didn't you plan better? Felt like someone peeling open the most vulnerable part of me, the part I'd been trying so hard to hold together. Within hours, screenshots of the text graphic spread online. Comments poured in. A hashtag built around my last message, no worries, Boda, circulated with stories from strangers who had been similarly dismissed by their own families. My parents and Nolan saw it, too. Friends and colleagues started texting them, asking if the man on TV could possibly be me. The fear, not of losing me, but of public judgment, finally mobilized them. And that's why, close to midnight, my hospital room door swung open. Nolan came in first, then my mother, Marianne, carrying a sad, drooping bouquet from a convenience store, and finally, my father, Grant. They looked frantic, their faces pale, not with the genuine fear of losing a son or a brother, but with the raw terror of exposure. "Oh, Louis," Marianne said, smoothing her coat down with deliberate care. That report made everything sound terrible. People are misunderstanding. Misunderstanding. Not what happened to me, but how they looked. For the first time, I saw them clearly, not as the family I longed for, but as panicked actors trying to manage a crisis of public relations. I watched Marianne fussing over the collar of her coat, repeating the word misunderstanding like a desperate mantra. The next morning, Dr. Paddle came in to discuss my discharge. He was a practical man, outlining the next steps clearly. "Your discharge needs are specific, Louis," he said. "No being alone for 48 hours. You need constant monitoring, proper heat, meals, and rest." The carbon monoxide exposure and hypothermia were severe. Before he finished speaking, Marianne jumped in, her voice high and insistent. "He'll come home with us, doctor." "Absolutely. Family sticks together." Nolan nodded quickly, standing beside her. "We have rearranged our schedules. We'll be there for him full time." The same people who had rejected me 48 hours earlier, citing client dinners and social calendars, were now volunteering full-time support because a doctor was present and the entire state was watching the television coverage. Dr. Paddle turned his full attention to me, his gaze steady. "What do you want, Louis?" The question stunned me into silence. "What do you want, Bada?" No one in my family had asked me that question with genuine sincerity in decades. Everything I had ever been asked was filtered through their needs, their schedule, their convenience. After the doctor left, Jessica, the night nurse, came in to check my vitals. She lowered her voice slightly. "You don't have to go with them if it doesn't feel right, Louis. We have options." The social worker, Ms. Davis, arrived shortly after and outlined them. A local hotel offering me 2 free weeks. Boda, a restoration company starting emergency repairs on my home, and neighbors, including Ethan Foster. Rotating check, ins to make sure I was never alone. Marianne bristled immediately. "He does not need strangers. This is a family matter. We are his support system." Nolan added, his tone laced with thinly veiled panic. "If he accepts all that, people will think we abandoned him. It will look terrible." Ms. Davis looked from Nolan to Marianne, then back at me before asking quietly, "Did you?" Their silence was the loudest answer the room had ever heard. I looked at them then. Boda. My mother was twisting her wedding ring, her mouth set in a hard, defensive line. Nolan was scrolling nervously through his phone notifications, likely damage controlling. My father was staring at the floor, unable to meet anyone's gaze. They were still prioritizing their image, even here, in the aftermath of my near death. Suddenly, Boda, Seraphina's voice, warm and fierce, echoed in my memory from that final day at the Sill airport. Don't let anyone tell you you are asking for too much. I took a deep breath, Boda, the air filling my lungs for the first time without the threat of carbon monoxide. I felt a surge of cold, absolute resolve. This was my one chance to break the lifelong conditioning. I'm choosing the hotel, I said, my voice quiet but steady. And the community support. I am not ready to go with you. Marianne stiffened, her face draining of color. She looked genuinely shocked. Not that I was rejecting her, but that I had the audacity to make a decision outside her control. You are embarrassing us, Lewis. I met her eyes. I didn't back down. I didn't apologize. The years of compliance, the decades of swallowing pain, suddenly burned away in that moment of absolute truth. I nearly died alone in my house. I answered. That embarrassment isn't mine. The room went silent, thick with unacknowledged guilt. For the first time in my life, I chose what kept me alive and safe, not what kept them comfortable and outwardly respectable. I chose Seraphina's truth over Marianne's reputation. Ms. Davis, the social worker, gave me a subtle, almost imperceptible nod of respect. She handed me the hotel paperwork. Nurse Jessica squeezed my shoulder as she passed, a small act of solidarity that meant more than any empty promise. My family stood huddled in a corner, whispering, shaken, not by my brush with death, but by the undeniable loss of control over their narrative. As the snow fell outside the hospital window, I realized this was the first decision in my life that truly belonged to me. The unburdening was complete. Bada. Stepping into the warmth of the hotel lobby, surrounded by the kindness of strangers and the scent of fresh coffee, felt like finally coming home. My first days at the Denver hotel felt unreal. I was greeted by name, and a receptionist offered a soft, "We are sorry for your loss." In my room waited a small gift basket and a handwritten card. The community is here for you. It struck me that strangers had done more for me in 48 hours than my own family had done in months. The social worker, Ms. Davis, encouraged me to join a grief support group. The room was simple folding chairs, quiet faces carrying their own storms. When it was my turn, I told the story fully for the first time. Sewell, the funeral alone, the empty airport ride, the freezing house, the carbon monoxide alarm, the neighbor who saved me. A man across the circle said he'd seen the news, but hearing it from you is different. For once, my story was heard as pain, not treated like a headline. I kept thinking about Seraphina's dreams and how lost I felt navigating everything alone. Seraphina had once dreamed of helping students study abroad without the fear of emergencies. So, I contacted our old university to establish a small scholarship in her name. I flew to Texas for the simple ceremony. I talked about Seraphina's courage, about the kindness of the strangers who became my safety net, and about how family is sometimes found, not inherited. When I finished, I noticed someone standing in the back near the door, my father. Grant. He didn't approach me. He didn't say a word, but he had been there the whole time. Days later, the university emailed me to thank me, Bada, mentioning an anonymous donor who had added a significant amount to the scholarship from someone trying to do a little better. I didn't need to ask who it was. I simply wrote back, "Leave it anonymous." The scholarship matters more than the name attached to it. Back in Boulder, my house felt different, warmer, safer. The restoration team had repaired everything: new flooring, insulated pipes, a smart thermostat set to keep the house from ever freezing again. Ethan Foster, the neighbor who saved me, brought soup and said he'd only relax once he saw steam coming from my chimney again. Bada. A few days later, I opened my mailbox to find an envelope addressed in my father's handwriting. Boda. He wrote that he had listened to my entire speech at the scholarship event, that seeing himself reflected in my words was painful, but true. He admitted he'd been absent not just during the blizzard, but during countless moments across my life. And for the first time, Boda, he didn't offer excuses. He simply said he wanted a chance to start somewhere honest. I wrote back, setting boundaries with a clarity I'd never had before. If we were to build anything, it had to be as two adults meeting on neutral ground, not a son performing for a family that wouldn't show up. He replied with 2 words, Saturday, Maple Street Diner. I'll be early. Our relationship settled into a new pattern. My connection with Marianne and Nolan settled into a polite distance. They sent holiday greetings and photos from dinners, comments that meticulously avoided every hard truth. I answered briefly, Bada, without resentment, but also without the hope that they would suddenly become different people. I no longer needed them to. A year after Seraphina died, I flew back to Seoul, this time to keep a promise, not to survive a catastrophe. At the cemetery, I sat before Seraphina's stone and told her everything: the freezing night, Ethan, the hospital, the scholarship, my father's small effort. I said. I still missed her fiercely, but that grief was no longer swallowing me. It had become something quieter, a companion, not a weight. Bada. I had finally learned that I was worthy of being looked after, and the man who never needed too much, was finally free to ask for everything.